Welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with CPA and personal financial specialist Phil Putney. Now let's get rolling with today's show. Hey everybody, welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts. We hope you're doing well this week as we talk investing, finance, and retirement like we usually do. And this week we're going to talk about how to get the ladies more involved with the financial decisions. Now, that might sound a little quirky at first, but the statistics are what they are. And traditionally, Phil, we do see that men tend to lead the charge, at least anyway, for our demographic that we typically talk to. But the good news is that has been changing more and more through the years, and more ladies are getting involved with the financial decisions, as they should. You know, and it's really funny. I'll preface this by saying I talk about financial stuff all day long, every day. It's what my job is. I'm not an advisor. I'm just a host, right? But I talk about this topic, yet my wife does most of the financial stuff for us, which, you know, it doesn't really matter necessarily. It's not really a gender thing, I think, but it just seems to have gone that way through the years, where a lot of times the men would take the lead in that, and whether the ladies were busy running the household or whatever the case is. So when it comes to financial, and this is about financial planning, which again is a little weird too, because I think a lot of times the ladies handle the typical household budget, but for some reason, financial planning, it seems to go the other way. Is that what you've seen through? I mean, you've been doing this a long time.
Yeah. I mean, again, kind of traditionally, you see the male is the one that is more involved in the finances,
right?
You know, whether that's just the role that they picked up or they enjoy it. The spouse doesn't, the wife doesn't,
right.
She's more involved with the kids and, like you said, taking care of the household.
Right.
That isn't always the case. I mean, we very often we'll see a scenario where, maybe the wife is more involved. She's the one paying the bills, or sometimes they each kind of maintain a piece of it themselves.
Right.
But yeah, it really comes down to, if it's in the more traditional, the fashion that the wife is the one that isn't as involved, or if it's not, if it's the roles switched, whoever that party that's not as involved really is kind of what we're talking about is, how do you get them involved? How do you bring them back around to some extent, and that's really the challenge is, what does that look like?
Yeah. Maybe we should just maybe we should just retitle this, just getting the person who's not as involved. Maybe that's a more modern way to approach it. But the statistics are what the statistics are.
Right. I mean, it's,
So I've got 4 simple categories here, just 4 simple things to dive into. And it's not an easy exercise, but let's, if you can picture the worst case scenario, I suppose that's really kind of the point of it, right? Because what often happens, and again, you've been doing this, many, many years now. And if both parties are not involved and the other person, typically the one who's been doing the handling that, they pass away, you're really left, behind the 8 ball, and you're really left struggling. Not only now are you dealing with the emotional component, but now you're picking up and you're getting thrown into the deep end really of this financial stuff. So maybe a good exercise is to picture the worst case scenario and how would you handle it? What would you do? Do you even know where to start?
Right. Yeah. And that's, something we always consider in our financial plan is we call it stress testing the plan, looking at what does that look like financially, but also just beyond that, not necessarily emotionally, but just logistically. Do you know where the passwords are to the accounts? Do you even know what the accounts are?
True.
There's all these different little pieces that, if that's not been your role, or you're just not your comfort, and you don't, it's been fine. You're okay spending the money and, handling those other pieces of it, but yet kind of the behind the scenes and what's going on, you've not been involved in. You need to have some basic understanding, and so that's always a discussion we have, and where actually an advisor can play a big role in somewhat continuity, let's call it, in that scenario, because as the advisor, you should have a good picture of their financial situation and have a plan mapped out. So, if one of the parties is no longer able to take care of that because of death or, even just disability.
I was going to say, there's that too.
There's a lot of other scenarios that might end up in the same type of scenario of that party not being involved.
Yeah.
But a financial advisor is a key person in that.
Go
even
ahead.
for, I mean, because I meet with several clients that, we'll do planning, but, maybe, and a lot of times, again, it's the husband that is, I understand investing and I really enjoy it. So they're going to do it,
Right.
but the wife is like, I have no idea.
So I definitely want to circle back to something because, like, even
Sure.
something as simple as the passwords and whatnot, no matter who's leading the charge, if they pass away and the other person doesn't know how to access some of this stuff, especially if you're working with an advisor, you're in a lot better shape because now
Right.
you can just call that
There's a
person
third party that can help. And
that
yeah.
can help. But if you're doing the DIY thing, like my wife, I've had heart surgery. I've got heart problems, and there's no guarantee. I mean, I'll be 50 this year, but there's no guarantee I see 60 or whatever else. And so, one day she was like, "I don't even know how to get into your computer." If something was to happen
Yep.
to you, and I'm like, I never really thought about it. So I had to make sure I jotted down, my passwords or whatever, so that she could at least get into my computer. And so that's a really good point. So I mean, yeah, having an advisor, I think, takes a big weight off. But if you're not, even if you have an advisor, I think there's still ways, if you're just not into it, if it's
Oh,
not your thing,
absolutely.
that
Yeah.
you could start to maybe go slow, maybe work, bring them
Yep.
on board a little bit at a time so that they're not overwhelmed, no matter who they are, but just
Right.
so that they have a good working knowledge. Is that maybe a fair way to get them involved?
Absolutely. And I mean, that happens often in the financial planning process where, I tell a couple, in the very beginning, I definitely want both of them involved,
Yeah.
just to make sure that we hear everyone's input as far as what
Oh,
your goals and objectives are.
sure.
Where are you trying to go with the money you have? What does
Right.
retirement look like? When we get into the middle of it, the nitty gritty and working all the details out, if it's the wife again, kind of the typical scenario that isn't as involved or doesn't really care, that's fine. They don't have to be in those meetings if they don't want. But again, when we get to the very end, when we finalized a plan and are going through that final delivery of it, I want them back involved just so they understand again, okay, here's what we've done. Here's the goals we talked about.
That's a good point.
Here's all the pieces. Here's the plan.
Right.
In our culmination of the financial plan is we do what we call a family estate organizer binder,
Right.
which brings together all their finances. So there's places to file all the different statements from the types of accounts they have, things on Social Security and pensions and wills and trusts and tax returns and passwords and all these different pieces. And it's a great place to bring everything together so that in that event, that spouse knows,
Right.
okay, or if both of them pass, the kids know, okay, well, here's
That's
the binder.
good.
This has kind of our story in it. This has the
Yeah.
the financial plan and kind of walks you through where everything's at.
Yeah, that's
So,
another good point too. I mean, that doesn't happen too often, but the odds are still possible. I mean, car accident or
right.
whatever the case might be, where both parties could pass away at the same time, or even close to one another. We've seen many stories of people who've been married,
Yeah.
40 years, and one passes away, and within weeks, sometimes the second one does.
Yep.
And maybe the kids just don't have any working knowledge. And it's like the car analogy that I use quite often on the shows, Phil, when I'm talking. Whether it's your thing or not your thing, most of us know how a car works, right? We know how
Right.
to get in
Right.
it, put gas in it, drive it, and we have a general idea of the functions of the car. But you don't have to know how to take the combustion engine apart and put it back together in order to drive a car. Well, the same
Right.
thing with your plan. Like, if it's just not your thing, you don't have to do all the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty, but be there in the beginning, have your input, have some of your say, get some of your thoughts out there,
Yep.
and then also know the general, I guess, the gist of it, so that
Right.
when something does happen to the other party, you're not just sitting there in the dark.
Right. Right. You have an idea of what this
Balance, I
looks
guess.
like. So
Balance.
yeah.
Maybe that's a good
I
way of putting
mean, and unfortunately, I've walked through this with clients that then life happens. You just don't expect it.
it.
And I mean, I've had it, both parties have passed away where, it's the one that is more involved that has passed, and the spouse is left. And what does that look like? And fortunately, I mean, she was somewhat involved, so she was pretty comfortable with it. And I mean, obviously a hard scenario, but financially,
Right.
everything was fine, and we were able to keep going and manipulate the plan a little bit
Right.
to make it work under the new scenario. But again, that's something that with that in mind too, you have to look at that. We call it a stress test to say financially, what does that look like if one of you passes? You know, does the asset in the plan you have still sustain that scenario? So,
Well, I mean, grab a cup of coffee, right? It's not an
yep,
easy exercise to go through, but sit down
right,
and go through it. Have the conversation. Make sure that you're both aware, no matter what
correct,
side of the statistics, what the statistics say, both be aware of the situation and then get some help. As to Phil's point, if you're doing it, and we talk a lot of times about it because it's become more popular for people to do, DIY so many things in life as it is. And
right,
COVID's kind of, added to some of that in a lot of ways. But at the same time, there's some arenas where I think you really just need to have a third party and another person to help. And this is one of those situations where I just feel like it really can be crucially important. And there's multiple levels of help, right, Phil? I mean,
right.
you don't have
Yeah,
to necessarily do everything for them. You can
correct.
kind of support.
Yeah, so we have those clients that we've done the financial planning, put a plan together.
Mhm.
They're implementing, if you want to think of it that way, the plan, so they're managing the investments back to the plan, but
Right.
we'll still get back together every 2-3 years just to revisit everything. Are we still on track? As things change in the plan, again, whether they want to be involved again in the actual implementation and management or whatever, that's a whole discussion then. But
Right. Sure.
at least there's some continuity in there of a plan. But yes, I mean, it's important to somehow get them involved to some extent, and ideally have a third party, whether directly involved today or not, there to, so that spouse isn't left just out in the cold, so to speak. And now what do I do?
Yeah. Well,
Having to deal with everything emotionally, but beyond that, the bills are still coming in. You still, I mean, you got to make sure, how
right.
does this thing work? So,
And that's been, again, based on the study, that's been the statistics, that's been the norm. Now, it has been changing more and more through the years, which is
right.
good
Yep.
to see. And we've done shows in the past on different scenarios where, make sure both parties are involved. And it just makes good sense. It just makes
Right.
good financial sense to do so. So, go through the exercise, picture the worst case scenario. Are you prepared to handle it if something unexpected comes out of the blue? If you're not, start taking it slow. Work through it a little bit at a time so
Yep.
that you feel comfortable, you don't feel overwhelmed. Find a good balance and then get some help. And you can reach
Yep.
out to Phil as always. If you're listening to the podcast, it's 248-888-7530. It's 248-888-7530. You can stop by the website, philstaxhacks.com. Again, that's philstaxhacks.com. If you're watching this on YouTube or whatever, you can certainly see all that information on the screen as well. And really, that's just the key. Right? We'll keep it short and sweet this week. Just get some help. No matter what side of the role you find yourself on,
Right.
don't sit there and just kind of put your head in the sand and say, well, the other person will handle it, or I'll get to it later. Because to your point, Phil, life is life, and you just never know what's going to happen.
You don't know when later is going to be now. I mean,
Exactly.
you have to act sooner rather than later. Have
Yeah.
that discussion at least up front, and have it regularly. Whether it's once a quarter, once every 6 months, at least once a year, to just kind of revisit things and bring that other party back into the
Yep.
game and say, hey, here's where we're at.
Yep.
Things are
Here's
still
what's going on.
good. This is any questions,
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, because whether it's COVID or a snowstorm or whatever,
That's right.
so do yourself a favor, do your retirement a favor, folks. Reach out to Phil, have a conversation, and don't forget to subscribe to Phil's Tax Hacks and other retirement facts on Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, whatever platform you choose. And we'll see you again in a week or so with another podcast. So for Phil, I'm Mark. We'll catch you next time right here on Phil's Tax Hacks and other retirement facts.
Investment advisory services offered through AFS Wealth Management. The content of this program is provided for informational purposes only and is not a solicitation or recommendation of any investment strategy. Investments and/or investment strategies involve risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will achieve its objectives.